All right, Algebra Lesson 9, reviewing multiplying and dividing by sign numbers. Should be pretty quick and easy. I just want to emphasize a couple things here. We can conceptualize why multiplying negative numbers and dividing negative numbers works. If I just look at the first practice problem, 2 times negative 4, okay? Well, if I go down here and if I had 4 negatives, right, and then I had 4 negatives, and I thought about what do I have all combined, right? I have one group of 4 negatives, another group of 4 negatives, all combined I would have 8 negatives, okay? So it's not as if the concepts for multiplying and dividing have changed just because we're using negatives. It's just sometimes harder to conceptualize when we're using, negative numbers. But I can still think of negative 4 times 2 as 2 groups of negative 4. Well, if I have 2 groups of 4 negatives, all combined, I have 8 negatives, right? Okay. Same thing for letter B. 3 groups of 2 negatives would be 6 negatives. Letter C. Now, this plus sign doesn't do anything, right? It's implied that a number is positive unless we have a negative sign in front of it. So I can conceptualize it the same way. 3 groups of 4 negatives would give me 12 negatives altogether. Now, for letter D, it's a little harder to conceptualize negative 3 groups of negative 5. Like, how do you have a negative group of something? But what I can do is I can just ignore one of the negative signs and say, well, I know that three groups of negative 5 is negative 15, and then my answer is just going to be the opposite of that, right? It's like my answer is the opposite of negative 15. Well, the opposite of negative 15 is positive 15, okay? So a negative times a negative does equal a positive, but again, you can kind of make sense of it because we can conceptualize why a positive times a negative equals a negative, right? I have 3 groups of negative 4, 3 groups of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 4. If I were to turn that positive number to a negative, then it would just turn the answer into the opposite of that, right? It would make the answer positive. So it's not just like some magic rule that a negative times a negative equals a positive. We can conceptualize it. Now for division, 4 divided by 2, okay, they're both positives, right? 4 divided by 2 is 2. Easiest problem you'll have all year. F, negative 6 divided by 3, I want to show how we can conceptualize that as well. If I had 6 negatives, and I said break them up into 3 groups, and how many are in each group? Well, if I take 6 negatives and break them up into 3 groups, there's going to be 2 negatives in each group. Right? I can still use the concept of division and make sense of it with negative numbers. I just have 6 negatives broken up into 3 different groups. There's 2 negatives in each group. Okay? Now, when you have positive 8 divided by negative 4, it's a little harder to conceptualize, having negative 4 groups. But I can kind of prove, from letter F that, okay, I know a negative divided by a positive is going to be a negative. Okay, so whether or not the dividend or the divisor is negative, I still just have one negative in the problem, right? So 8 divided by negative 4 will be negative 2. The other way I could think of it is, okay, well, what times negative 4 would equal 8, right? Something times negative 4 will equal 8. We can just think of the inverse operation. Well, that'd have to be negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 4 equals 8. And then, sorry about that. For letter H, now I have a negative divided by negative. And just like with my multiplication problem, that's going to turn the answer back to positive. Right? I could get rid of this negative here and say, okay, negative 16 divided into 2 groups would be negative 8. But then I have another negative, so it's the opposite of that, right? It's positive 8, okay? So quick review of multiplying and dividing negatives. I just want to emphasize that we can still conceptualize, how to multiply and divide with negatives. We can still conceptualize it just using what we already know about multiplication and division. All right. See you back for lesson 10.